Now that we've looked at payment, let's turn our attention to the retention of title clause. This is a contract clause that's very specific to a contract for the sale and purchase of goods, and it deals with exactly when the ownership of goods passes from the seller to the buyer. This ownership is sometimes called having title to the goods, and sometimes it's called having property in the goods. Both of these phrases mean to have legal ownership of the goods, whatever they happen to be. Now, if the contract fails to specify precisely when ownership passes from a seller to a buyer, the default position in law is generally that it passes upon delivery. This is why so many contracts choose to make it clear in the written contract that the buyer will become the owner of the goods, not upon delivery, but only when payment in full is received by the seller. If we look at our contract for the sale of jeans, you may wonder what the benefit of a retention of title clause is for the seller. After all, if the buyer in the UK has possession of the jeans and has maybe even started selling them from their website and in their stores, what does it matter who legally owns them?
Well, the answer to that question concerns the possible insolvency of the buyer in the period of time that's most dangerous for the seller. If we think about that 30-day period in which the seller doesn't have possession of its own goods, but hasn't yet received payment for them, it puts the seller in a potentially vulnerable position. Yes, sure, the seller will have carried out some due diligence by doing some investigation about the buyer's financial position before entering into this contract. But there's always the possibility that the seller is a corporation that goes bankrupt before a particular payment is made. In the UK, they describe this as the seller being a company that goes into liquidation. And when a company goes into liquidation, the liquidator's job is to sell the company's assets to raise cash to pay the creditors. And what is an asset? It can be defined as something of value that the debtor owns. You can see then that it's vital to the seller that a consignment of goods doesn't become the legal property of the buyer before the buyer has paid for them. That risks the unpaid for goods being sold to pay the buyer's debts in the event of the buyer's insolvency. A contract is all about sharing risks and liabilities between the parties. By including a retention of title clause, the seller can prevent the risk of unpaid for goods being sold to pay off the buyer's debts, and may be seen as an essential clause by some sellers in contracts where the governing law otherwise sees title passing upon delivery.